Have you heard of obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD? Well, on this video, I'm going to explore what OCD is and its connection to autism. Let's go. Great to see you again. Welcome back. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out this video. Now, if this is the first time you've checked out a video of mine, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out my channel and to check out my content. I'm Orion Kelly, that autistic guy, and since my diagnosis later in life, I've devoted my time to advocating for the autistic community. I do that through my content, my podcasts, and these YouTube videos. My goal is to raise a level of understanding, acceptance, and appreciation of the autistic community. So if you'd like to be a part of that, you can join the community by subscribing to my YouTube channel. And look, really importantly, if you can share my videos, like them, rate them, comment, more people see them, and then we reach more people to hopefully increase the level of understanding and acceptance of autistic people. And if you want more info on me, my podcasts, videos, or just send me an email and say, hey, go to my website, orionkelly.com.au. So, what is OCD and how is it connected to autism? All right, well, before we unpack that, let's just quickly define OCD. To define OCD, let's go to the DSM-5. And for those wondering, what on God's name is that? We're talking about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and we're up to the 5th edition. Okay, so the DSM-5 defines obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, as A, the presence of obsessions, compulsions, or both. B, the obsessions or compulsions are time-consuming or cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. C, the obsessive compulsive symptoms are not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance, for example, a drug of abuse or a medication or another medical condition. And D, the disturbance is not better explained by the symptoms of another mental disorder, including repetitive patterns of behavior, as in autism spectrum disorder. That old chestnut. So, OCD, the presence of obsessions, compulsions, or both. Let's have a deep dive, well, technically more of a snorkel, into the world of obsessions when we relate them to OCD. The DSM-5 defines obsessions as, number one, recurrent and persistent thoughts, urges, or impulses that are experienced at some time during the disturbance as intrusive and unwanted, and that in most individuals cause marked anxiety or distress. And number two, the individual attempts to ignore or suppress such thoughts, urges, or images, or to neutralize them with some other thought or action, which the DSM-5 offers an example could be performing a compulsion. And of course, we'll get to compulsions in just a minute. So what would be some examples of typical obsessions? Well, the DSM-5 have a list of some typical obsessions. Fear of getting contaminated by people or the environment, disturbing sexual thoughts or images, fear of blurting out obscenities or insults, extreme concern with order, symmetry or precision, recurrent intrusive thoughts of sounds, images, words or numbers, and fear of losing or discarding something important. As I read out some of those typical obsessive behaviors, you may have thought, oh, that's interesting. I can kind of relate to some of those. And that's why this video is really interesting. You may be autistic and you may feel, oh, maybe I have OCD. And as we discuss this, you may realize that some of the reasons why you feel like you do, but you actually don't, is what is the difference between being diagnosed with OCD and being an autistic person. Like the first example, that fear of being contaminated by people or environments, situations. As an autistic person, you might be able to relate to that, right? This idea that people and places could give you a feeling, a sensation, or contaminate you in some way, right? That might be something that you think about. Another example that kind of related to me, you might resonate with it too, is that concern, that extreme concern with order, with symmetry, precision. Now, all autistic people are different. There might be some bloody messy autistic people, like anyone else. And some autistic people may thrive on order and symmetry and precision. Now, some of that can be down to routine, down to specific rituals, the predictability of life in a world that doesn't offer a life made for us. And in addition to that, I personally am a very precision, symmetry, ordered kind of person. My spaces, my areas, there's just the right place for them. Now you would go, oh, OCD, right? Okay, potentially. But it can also be looked at as the point of view of the way an autistic person keeps themselves regulated and comfortable in a world that's not made for them. So this is where it becomes really interesting. The example of another typical behavior the DSM mentioned, which is that kind of fear of losing things. As an autistic person, and again, we're talking about it from two different angles here. As an autistic person, things that are near and dear or special to me or important to me, I put in a place. Right? I don't leave things lying around. If I do, then they mean nothing to me. So if those things go missing, that's a big thing for me. And the idea that someone could even go into my space and potentially have access to some certain things, let alone take them or move them, is not good, for mind-blowing, not wow, bad, right? As I want to know where it is. Until I find where my thing is that someone has moved from where I put it, life stops. I think there's still a big difference there, but maybe there isn't. And again, this is the conversation. It's a conversation, the connection between OCD and autism. Could you technically be diagnosed with both? Or could you technically just have the one, but still experience both? It's such an interesting conversation. From obsessions to compulsions. And once again, the DSM-5 defines compulsions as 1, repetitive behaviors, example, hand washing, ordering, checking, or mental acts, example, praying, counting, repeating words silently, that the individual feels driven to perform in response to an obsession or according to rules that must be applied rigidly. And number 2, the behaviours or mental acts are aimed at preventing or reducing anxiety or distress or preventing some dreaded event or situation. However, these behaviours or mental acts are not connected in a realistic way with what they are designed to neutralise or prevent, or are clearly excessive. All right, so once again, examples. What are some examples? Well, the DSM-5 provide some typical examples of compulsions. Like we touched on, excessive or ritualized hand washing, showering, brushing your teeth, going to the toilet, repeated cleaning of household objects, ordering or arranging things in a particular way, repeatedly checking locks, switches, appliances, constantly seeking approval or reassurance. Hey, this is me. And repeated counting to a certain number. Okay, I think I'm in licorice all sorts here, my friends. Wow. Doesn't everyone do that? Like, for example, you know when you make a baby bottle or you're trying to make yourself a milkshake or something, when you're shaking it, do you count to 10? Like 1, 2, 3. No? Okay. I'm autistic. I haven't been diagnosed with OCD. Should I be? Would I be? Is it the same thing? What's the connection? What's the difference? Okay, so we've established what OCD is. We've talked about obsessions and compulsions. And now let's unpack the connection, if any, between OCD and autism. What is the connection? Now, research is research. Okay, you can always find what you need. I found some that was published in 2015, which talked about a likelihood of diagnosis of OCD in autistic people being increased. What's interesting is, what about the other way around? It was reported that those first diagnosed with autism were 2 times more likely to be later diagnosed with OCD, while people with OCD were nearly 4 times more likely to be diagnosed with autism later in life. Okay, let's just stop for a second. Okay, what they're saying is if you're autistic, you've got a likelihood of also having a diagnosis of OCD, or if you were diagnosed with OCD first up, there's a likelihood later in life, potentially in adulthood, you could be diagnosed with autism, 4 times more likely. And what's interesting about this is, if we talk about this from a gender point of view, because, from my point of view, Autism can be very male-centric, and even more specifically, very white male-centric in its view, its lens, its diagnostic criteria, its literature, its commentary, everything. Okay, and I find from talking to autistic women and talking to autistic people, the community, that a lot of women who are diagnosed autistic much later in life, that could be 20s, 30s, 40s, I find that's kind of the ballpark, were diagnosed with other things in childhood or in teenage years. And OCD is one thing that always comes to mind. OCD, ADHD, eating disorders. These are the kind of things they were diagnosed with earlier in their lifetime, childhood. And what tells me is, okay, so number one, like a lot of autistic people, we can fall under the cracks because people are only looking for a specific type of presentation. And for girls and women, it can come across very differently. That's why we're so far behind catching up on how to properly diagnose all people, not just white boys. So this is really interesting to me. OCD, 4 times more likely to be diagnosed autistic later in life. So we can start to see the connections here. Is it all connected though? Well, some recent studies have actually tried to distinguish OCD from autism. And what they do is they, in essence, point out that with OCD, the obsessions, those we talked about, those kind of examples of typical obsessions, those obsessions spark compulsions. So in OCD, those obsessions you have spark compulsions, not autistic traits. If you have OCD, your obsessions spark compulsions, compulsive behavior. They don't spark autistic behavior, autistic traits. Does that make sense? I guess another way of putting it is people with OCD don't change or swap around their specific rituals, right? They must do a certain thing in a certain way to alleviate anxiety around whatever it is. So that compulsion, that behavior is a certain thing that's done in a certain way to alleviate a particular obsession, right? Does that make sense? So how is that different to autistic people? Well, from my personal experience alone, I find as an autistic person, I think in many cases, autistic people can often pick and choose the way they wish to tackle anxieties, the way they wish to soothe themselves, regulate themselves, the way they wish to stim. The idea that an autistic person only has one stim for every hypersensitive feeling, sensory input, emotion, output, whatever, doesn't make a lot of sense. We tend to do different stims for different situations. Now, you could say, well, hang on, but you might still do the same stim to alleviate the same thing. That's OCD. And from my point of view, I think, well, that's probably right in some cases, but from a general point of view, that's probably a differential. The way autistic people don't actually need to stick hard and fast. We can pick and choose the types of stims and I guess the way we regulate ourselves really at any given time to whatever feels right. More specifically, autistic people will pick and choose the repetitive behaviors or the stimming that they feel is just right in that moment. Why are you playing with your shoe? Or why are you playing with your nails? Or why are you playing with your laces? Or why are you holding that like that? It's like, well, it was there. I needed something. I'm not saying it's everyone, but experience for myself and my autistic son is we can find the strangest little things laying around, and next thing you know, it becomes like a stimming toy. And it's helping us through something clearly where we wouldn't need it or do it or pick it up. I guess that's another way of talking about the differential between OCD and autism. For an autistic person, different things can soothe, different things can regulate in different situations, in different circumstances. So thinking about it then, the clear challenge here is trying to distinguish the difference between a manifestation of obsessions and manifestations of autism. Whoa. I'm asking myself too many questions today. An example, a person with OCD, so not a person diagnosed as autistic, just diagnosed with OCD, may, because of their anxiety, withdraw from social situations and use ritualistic behaviors. Sounds pretty close to what an autistic person would do. Okay, well, let me give you an autistic example. Okay, so an autistic person, on the other hand, may struggle with social interaction, may struggle with social situations, but they may avoid it, or they may use stimming to soothe and regulate. You know, this is going to sound like a uni lecture because all I'm doing is asking questions and not giving you answers, but I think that's the best way to have this conversation. I'm not the man that knows everything. I'm just a dude, an autistic dude. So here's a couple of questions based on this connection and also the way we can kind of differentiate it. Even though we know there's a strong link between one diagnosis leading to the other, we do know they are two separate diagnoses and therefore they are two completely separate experiences. So a couple of questions I think are really important to ask. Based on those examples I just gave about the whole avoiding social situations, etc. Is the repetitive behavior being used to reduce anxiety to a certain fear? So you have those obsessions and the compulsions, I guess, you use in some way to drown out the obsessions. Or is the repetitive behavior being used to regulate over or under stimulation in an environment? Clearly the second one is an autistic example. It's tricky, right? Are you doing a repetitive behavior to alleviate anxiety to a particular fear via your OCD? Or is the repetitive behavior being used in a stimming sense to regulate from being over or under stimulated in a certain environment or situation? When you say it back to back, then it starts to make you go, whoa, what? Whoa. All right, I think we're getting into these now. If you like them, write it down in the comments. Here's one for you. Okay, let's run this one by you. Is the person stuck on something because it's a ritual, it's a means of alleviating anxiety through a particular behavior? Or is the person stuck on something because they're engaged in an activity they enjoy? They're stuck on a task they want to be stuck on. In other words, doing a task you love so much has caused you to forget about other things and therefore become stuck on doing that task that you love so much. Stuck on something because it's part of a ritual, or stuck on something because you're doing a task that you love to do. The nuances, it can be so close and yet so far. The connection, the clear connection between OCD and autism, and the subtle differences. And I think we can see, well, that makes sense, right? Because they're separate diagnosed conditions, right? You've got OCD and you've got autism. Just because there's a likelihood one or the other can lead to a diagnosis of the other doesn't mean that it mixes them all up. This is one of those things where this isn't a diagnostic video. I'm not diagnosing people here. I'm just an autistic guy. You want to do that, you need to go and see a healthcare practitioner, your GP, whatever. But what I'm saying is, as a conversation, this is really interesting, isn't it? OCD and autism. There you have it. OCD, autism, the connection, the differences broken down. You're welcome, my friend. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, share the video so we can reach more people and hopefully raise that level of understanding, acceptance and appreciation of the autistic community. Thank you so much for watching. Until my next video, thank you for your support and we'll talk soon.